And Suba, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Trudy. Let me add in my good afternoon and welcome to all the folks joining us from all around the country. I think I win the bet with Trudy. Nobody, well, so far, Alaska. So far, nobody's here from another raised from another country, but we still have time. Anyway, I'm Suba Seti. I'm a volunteer community ambassador with ARP here in Northern Virginia. From our earliest beginnings, ARP championed lifelong learning. That's why ARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April at 3 o'clock Eastern Time for curious explorers. For more than 60 years, ARP has been a wise friend and fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. ARP has earned a reputation as a wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as a wise friend and fierce defender, AARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As a wise friend in your corner, ARP helps you protect yourself and loved ones from fraud, get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun, like what we're doing today with our Tuesday Explorers program. I hope you will continue to take advantage of these opportunities and more. So, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome back Jim Lewis. He's been with us and a friend, and I'm so glad that he supports us so like the way he does. Let me tell you a little bit about Jim. Most of you probably already know and probably have know everything about his bio, but for the new folks, Jim Lewis is a noted local historian and lecturer who focuses primarily on the American Civil War and World War II. He has also ventured into local colonial era history as well as the Cold War and such eclectic topics that include his Drop Dead Gorgeous presentation. In addition, many have attended one of his local Civil War tours, most notably the Hunter Mill Road Corridor and historic Centerville. I was there and it was amazing. His efforts have been recognized by his Lord Fairfax designation by the Hunter Mill District. Finally, he has authored more than 30 historical markers. Jim, welcome back, and the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Suba. I appreciate the intro, and it's always a pleasure to be back with the AARP folks. First-class operation, as far as I could see, particularly as a host for a presenter. So anyway, without further ado, we've got a lot to cover. And I'd like to start this particular presentation off with a disclosure. I have never been associated with the CIA. However, I run around with a bunch of them. So I know them. I know quite a few. And obviously in Northern Virginia, they're everywhere. But anyway, I just want to give you kind of a heads up that there's no skin in the game on this for me at this point. So anyway, let's start everything off with the year 1968. As massive turmoil and cultural changes were going on throughout the world, and I'm talking the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the USS Pueblo incident being seized by North Korea, and of course domestically we had some problems, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, assassinations in the United States, and the Cold War, particularly with regards to the Soviet Union and the US in the midst of an arms race and intelligence war with each other. One of the most powerful weapons at the time was a submarine equipped with ballistic missiles. When operating close to the enemy's sea border, it could theoretically wipe out an entire city or military target, particularly on the West Coast. Fear drove a number of U.S. families to construct bomb shelters. I wouldn't doubt a number of you all can recollect back when you were younger and you'd see these tractor trailers hauling these big shelters down the road. I certainly remember them. and those were bomb shelters. Hence, subs were of strategic importance for dominance in the ocean. Okay, one such sub was this sub right here. And this was K-129, the nomenclature for it, Gulf II class. Now, this was armed with 3 revolutionary R-21 ballistic missiles, each with a 1 megaton punch. Now, that equated to 65 times Fat Man, the bomb that hit Nagasaki. And it was capable of being launched deep underwater. Now, check this sub out for just a second before we go on. It has an elongated conning tower up here, also called a sail. And here's where the 3 outlets were located for the missiles that would have potentially been launched. Now, it also carried 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which was, they were in the forward launch tubes. Even though this was a diesel sub, it was outfitted with the latest Soviet Union technology and operated out of the remote and frigid naval base on the Kamchatka Peninsula, heading into the treacherous North Pacific Ocean. Here's the commander. Believe it or not, his name's Kobzar, 38 years old, and ironically, he's Ukrainian. Rings a bell today. And he was very highly regarded, so much so that it was thought that he was going to take over the Soviet subforce. However, mid-March, 68, on a routine patrol towards Hawaii, the sub went missing, as it missed 2 consecutive prearranged radio check-ins with the superiors at Kamchatka. The Soviet Navy had never lost a sub with nukes on board, and the idea of it happening was its worst nightmare. Just about a week later, May 21, sitting off the coast of Kamchatka, our USS Barb, it's one of our subs. We listened and watched 24/7 back then, and we still do, quite frankly. That sub heard something equivalent to the start of the Daytona 500, an entire subgroup racing out of port with active sonar and no apparent worry about detection. That was part of a large 40 vessel and 53 aircraft search and rescue effort, looking frantically for this sub right here. Their assigned search zone was about 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii and included, and get this, tells you a little bit about the situation with regards to the Soviet Navy back at that time. Their search zone was 854,000 square miles, or 1.5 times Alaska. Obviously, the Soviet Navy really had no clue where this sub was. After 2 months, the search was called off. However, the U.S. had noticed, and Navy intel correctly ascertained that it was a K-129. Secret briefings began immediately at the Pentagon and Langley regarding the viability of bringing it up because of a potential treasure trove that it would offer. Examples: 3 state-of-the-art ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, as I mentioned, and the latest cryptographic gear, including codes and code books, and understanding how the K-129 sonar systems operated and was kept quiet. Despite this being LBJ's last year as president, he decided it was worth exploring the opportunity. You all know this fellow right here, Nixon. Here they are in 1968. Who knows? They may have been discussing just what we're talking about tonight, or this afternoon. Nixon would later embrace and champion this project. But first, the U.S. had to locate the sub and determine whether or not it was still intact enough to recover it. Well, unbeknownst to the Soviets, the U.S. had tools via a passive underwater listening system using an array of underwater hydrophone sensors embedded in both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. And they were there to detect Soviet sub-movements or nuclear detonations. This was courtesy of 1947 U.S. Air Force employed or deployed AFTEC, courtesy of Eisenhower, who didn't trust the Soviets after World War II for obvious reasons. And then 1950s U.S. Navy deployed SOSUS, S-O-S-U-S, another system. Both operated out of U.S. Navy facilities and ships. Now this is SOSA in the mid-70s, 1970s right here. These black stars are the shore processing stations. And down here is how everything would work. Here's the hydrophones sensing, and then a shipping station, one of these black stars, and the communication would be sent everywhere. It just so happened that both systems had detected an event consistent with sounds emanating from a sinking sub. Now, SOSUS had honed in on March 8th as the date. The signatures were triangulated and the event location was determined to be within a circle of approximately, now how many square miles did I tell you Russia was looking in? 854,000. Our box or patrol box was 4 miles in diameter. So a little bit smaller window to look at. Okay, here's the recovery site. Our projected recovery site right here. Here's the Kamchatka area, and that's, I can't even pronounce this. That's a big naval base, very important naval base for the Russians at this time, of course, the Pacific. Now you will hear more about Long Beach shortly, but this is right above Midway. And of course, the sub was headed towards Pearl Harbor. And we're talking about 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. Now, this is, I can't tell you how important this is. This is absolutely amazing. So we found the sub. And let me tell you what we're talking about here. The depth at which the sub was found, K-129, was some 16,800 feet deep. I want to give you a comparison here. The deepest spot in the Chesapeake Bay is 174 feet. It's up here. Titanic, right here, 12,500, 2 miles. This is Malaysian Airline Flight 370. That's at 15,000. And there's still hope of recapturing or locating the data recorder, but you'd never hear of anybody talking about bringing up the fuselage, basically the plane. Down here, around 17,000 feet, is our K-129. And this is before the era of modern computing. Okay, July of '68, U.S. Navy launches a full-scale search, codenamed Operation Sand Dollar, conducted by this sub right here. This is a converted, modified sub, especially for our undersea intelligence arsenal. The Russians didn't have anything like this. And obviously, this cannot go down to 17,000 feet. So in addition to, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, how we discovered it. And this is the Halibut leaving San Francisco in the mid-1970s. This mission was not only difficult, but it was also dangerous, as for 2 weeks, a Soviet warship circulated overhead using sonar to continue the search for the K-129. Halibut, and that's the name of the sub, avoided detection by positioning itself under a layer of cold water while the warmer water above reflected the sonar sounds. So how could Halibut detect K-129 down 17,000 feet? Well, because of this. This is called the fish. It's 2 tons and 12 foot long, and it was towed and contained a remotely controlled camera, strobe lights, and sonar for detecting seafloor objects. Normally, and here it is a side view, here's the fish. They normally carry 2 fishes. And this, by the way, is the back cave. This was converted. This used to enable the firing of Regulus missiles that we had before we went underwater with our missiles. We would have to deploy and fire our missiles while we were on top of the water at surface, if you will. But this was converted into what was called back cave. And basically it had a Sperry UNIVAC computer, and it was a fully outfitted photographic darkroom. After reaching the projected recovery area, Halibut methodically studied and took more than 20,000 photos over the area over the next 3 weeks. Okay, August 20th, again, 68, LBJ's gamble paid off. As I mentioned, Halibut came across the wreck of the K-129. It had found that it had broken into 3 pieces. The largest would be similar to what you're looking at right here. Now, I just want to give you a heads up. A lot of this stuff has not been declassified for public consumption. So both of these are illustrations of what the cameras saw. The largest piece that they found was what was called the forward sections, 136 feet long, and it appeared to contain the cap of the #1 missile tube, which was critical because we wanted one of those nuclear missiles. And it's possible the missile could have survived. And it was also the most likely portion to have contained the code books and operating manuals. Hence, this was designated as the target object. The US government, as I mentioned, has never released any of the photos associated with what they found. And by the way, this is a depiction that was used in a 2010 documentary. It also found that the forward section was leaning over on its starboard side just a little bit. So that's where this came from. It was a documentary. When what the CIA was interested in appeared to be there for the taking if the US could somehow figure out how to get them. Well, January of '69, Nixon's inaugurated president. When he saw Halibut's photos, he jumped up and down basically, and he realized the potential and wanted more. He authorized a salvage attempt after considerable consultation with this fellow, Melvin Laird. He was a defense secretary, and everybody knows Henry Kissinger. He was a national security advisor with Nixon throughout his tenure. Given the environment, this project should have gone to the Navy. However, when queried, the admiral who was heading up, chief of US Navy Ops, responded they had no workable plan to exploit the sub. So they looked around a little bit more and offered it to the CIA, the Special Activities Division, which was also responsible for the U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird. And they jumped all over it. They were looking for something like this. And another reason they gave it to the CIA was it was felt that they would have a better chance of keeping everything black, i.e. clandestine and secret. Now, this fellow right here really headed up and this is Carl Duckett. He was director of the Special Activities Division. You will see him later, and you will see this fellow right here. And August 19th, the project was codenamed Project Azorian. The program was handed over to a special security department headed up by this fellow right here, John Parangoski. He was a blunt, strong leader and arguably the CIA's most valuable program manager. He was obsessed with secrecy, and most of his project contractors only knew him as Mr. P, as in Paul. That's his last name, Parangosky. He began by handpicking the best scientists and engineers, now mostly aerospace, because that's what they were used to, and set them up in a secret satellite office near Tyson's Corner, Virginia. There they began researching various methods for raising the sub. Given the situation, Mr. P, they realized that this sub was way too deep for a diver, and no adequate remote operated vehicle existed yet that could get it. Therefore, Mr. P decided to pay a visit to one company that was acknowledged as the country's foremost maker of exotic deep sea drill ships. Here we go. November 3rd, Mr. P, and here he is again, and two members of his project team walked into this fellow's office, Curtis Crook, and he is the VP of engineering at Global Marine in LA, California. They closed the door. This guy's door was never closed. Well, they closed it for this meeting. Mr. P continued. He explained that the Global Marine was the only company in the world that might be able to handle a job that interested the CIA. He then asked whether it was feasible to lift something weighing several thousands of tons from the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 15 to 20,000 feet. Now, this is important. Heretofore, the deepest ocean salvage of a ship was the raising of the USS submarine Squalus from a depth of 245 feet versus 17,000 is what we're talking about. By the way, that sub was raised in 1939, year World War II started. So Crook thought a moment. It sounded like a ridiculous proposition, but not necessarily impossible. He'd have to get back to him. So Mr. P and his two associates leave. Crook pulls this out, Jane's Fighting Ships, and it's the go-to book for anything naval in the world. He looked at the Soviet subsection and smiled as the numbers worked more or less. However, more due diligence would be required for feasibility purposes. Now, 1970 July, a year after exploring a variety of possible methods, it was decided the best approach to lift K-129's remains was the grunt lift. Grunt lift. Simply put, a simple lifting string of steel pipe that would lower a claw to the bottom of the ocean, grab the target object, and lift it back into the ship. The probability of success at this time was estimated to be 10%. However, the potential treasure trove of intel continued to justify the program. This fellow sketched out the recovery system. His name is John Graham. He's with Global Marine. Here's what he sketched out. There were three primary components. Obviously, you had to have a heavy-duty ship to deal with all the weight it was going to have to deal with. You had a capture vehicle. This is also known as the Claw, affectionately known informally as Clementine. And the third portion or component was a humongous barge that was submersible, which is where this would hide out. Go submersible and then come up into what is called the moon pool, which is basically a hole in the ship. And it enabled anything in that moon pool to get to and from the ocean. So that's how this thing was going to work. Now, let me just point out this ship just for a second. This was a super heavy derrick that was gimbaled. In other words, as the ocean would, slosh back and forth with waves, it would stay stable and straight. And it was designed to hold 3 miles. And that's 17,000, 3 miles of pipe string. That pipe string was going to weigh 8 million pounds. The claw was going to weigh 4 million pounds. And the target object, the forward section of the K-129, was going to equal 4 million pounds. So this thing right here was going to pull up 16 million pounds. Now that's the equivalent of 450 empty Greyhound buses. So this moon pool, and that's the hole in the ship, that's what it was called, it's 200 feet long, and that was built to accommodate the target object that they were going after. In the bottom of it, it had 9 feet thick sliding gates to enable closure or opening to the ocean. And here's those gates right here that are opened up. And this is a depiction of obviously the Clementine, if you will, coming out of the moon pool from up top. So the capture vehicle had fingers and breakout legs. Obviously, these fingers were the wrap around the sub, and these are breakaway sections, and they basically acted as jacks, like on a car, where it would settle on the floor, seabed floor, give it a foundation and a base so that the rest of the target vehicle could grab the sub and lift it back up via the pipe string, as I mentioned. By the way, here's the string right here. And this is how they put everything together to form 3 miles. They screwed one end into the other. And I won't go into any more detail about this, but we're talking 60-foot sections, and they were called doubles. This barge served 2 purposes. And I'm talking a submersible barge. It provided a secure facility in which the capture vehicle could be built. This is the most secret thing that could never be explained. They had to hide this from get to go forever. They built it inside this barge. And the barge was also going to be used to transport the capture vehicle at some point to the ship. And they had retractable roof up top that would open up, and the capture vehicle would then lift into the moon pool by way of these 4 docking legs that would come down and grab the ends of the capture vehicle right here and on the other side. So it gives you a feel as to how this thing was going to work. Now, the ship's feasibility studies checked out. Minor problem. It was larger than most World War II battleships and aircraft carriers. And this was constructed in Philly at the Sun Shipbuilders Yard. And as you could tell, here's the name, Hughes Glomar Explorer. Glomar was short for Global Marine. But how on earth could the U.S. explain a giant ship so big without anybody noticing? They couldn't. They knew it. More importantly, how could it be parked in the Pacific for weeks in an area where a Soviet sub went missing? Well, a cover story was needed, and the CIA and Global Marine came up with a doozy, one that was bigger than the ship itself. Oceanographers had long known areas of Pacific floor at depths of 14 to 17,000 feet were carpeted with manganese nodules. One of them right here. This contained rare minerals. And what they figured, it was plausible to say that a ship with a novel mining system was being built to explore the feasibility of deep sea mining manganese for profit. For the cover to work, though, someone had to own the ship, and it couldn't be the CIA. They would decide on the country's most famous and wealthy eccentric, sort of the Elon Musk of the day. Without further ado, that's why you've got the Hughes Glomar Explorer that was on the side of the ship a little bit earlier. Of course, Howard Hughes. And here he is testifying in World War II to the Senate Investigating Committee, the Senate War Investigating Committee. He had a track record of doing the weird, the extravagant. Everybody knew it. They knew it all around the world. So for him to say that he's going to do something like this, everybody just smiled and said, okay, here he goes again. By the way, most people are familiar with, this is the infamous Spruce Goose, which he built. Unbelievably, this was built for World War II, and it was never intended to fly. It was a boat, a sea boat. It was only intended to fly a few feet above the water because it was going to be a troop transport, enabling the transport of troops above the subs, the German subs, that they couldn't hit this thing. So it was successful. The only thing is he finished it in 1947 after the war, but he built it, he flew it, it worked. Anyway, his SUMA, S-U-M-A corporation was the perfect front for the endeavor, as it was a collection of privately owned corporations and not responsible to stockholders or the SEC. SUMA also had a very strong association with Global Marine. When approached by the CIA, Hughes immediately agreed to lend his name to the project. Everyone bought the story, including the media. As part of the ruse, a fabricated press release in 1972 celebrated the ship with a champagne christening ceremony. The ship was perfectly hidden in plain sight. Now, at this time, Mr. P's Azorian team then established a secret office in some of the SUMA Corporation's space near LA International Airport, where it would become the center of the engineering effort to outfit the ship for the mission when it arrived from the East Coast. Meanwhile, a little bit of context, Nixon is publicly painting himself as a peacemaker and statesman via the SALT talks with Leonid Brezhnev. Given the obvious conflict of what was going on here, a top secret 40 committee review was convened to consider whether to go forward with Project Azorian. The response was far from positive. In any event, Nixon, with Kissinger's support, would shun the naysayers and order the project to proceed. Just FYI, here's the barge, retractable roof right here. And you'll see it, I'll show you a picture in just a second of it retracted and the capture vehicle in it. But here it is, and it was being built also in California, Redwood City, at Lockheed's facility. This thing was 324 feet long, longer than the football field, 90 feet high, and 106 foot wide. And here it is, tied up at Redwood facility after the mission I'm going to tell you about shortly was completed. And give you a feel for the size of this baby. These are tugboats right here. So they're maneuvering it. It was billed to the public as a support dry dock in support of the deep mining venture. And it's also where the Explorer crew trained on a mock-up sub for the recovery. So this is where capture vehicle Clementine was built, and they trained for the mission inside this structure right here. Okay, I mentioned to you I'd show you the retractable roof. Here it is. The roof is retracted. There's Clementine, the capture vehicle. Here are the extenders that I mentioned that acted like jacks on a car and everything. And over here, here is the capture vehicle inside the moon pool. Here are the fingers, some of the hydraulics. Here are the extractors, 2 of them in the back. Right here, there they are. Here's the moon pool. Looking down into the moon pool. Now check this guy out. You get a feel for how big it is. And remember those doors 9 foot thick that I said that opened up to the ocean. Here they are. They're just about closed. And here is a capture vehicle inside the moon pool later on, black and white photo. These, by the way, these spheres right here contain the electronics of everything that was going to command the hydraulics and everything associated, with the capture vehicle. So that's what these spheres are for. Anyway, July 23, 1973, Explorer was completed and delivered to Global Marine. And you get a feel for how big this ship is. There you go. There's the crew up here. Again, Hughes Global Explorer. The following day, it set sail for the West Coast. The voyage took 50 days, and its route took it down the east coast of South America and around the Cape Horn via the Straits of Magellan. First question you got to ask, what happened to the Panama Canal? Well, the answer is this ship was too damn big. In particular, it was too wide. And that is the reason for it is that after they built this, they were concerned, or as they were building it, that it was top heavy, particularly with that big gimbaled, trestle up top here, that it might flip over, if you will. So they added another 10 feet in width, and that meant it was 6 more feet than the Panama Canal's 110 feet locks. So as a result, it lost significant time by having to go around South Africa. And that time absolutely was needed to self-test this thing because the machinery on it was incredibly complex. Time was important because only a small 10-week weather window, July to mid-September, in the North Pacific was deemed acceptable for the mission. If delayed beyond the window, then they faced a 1-year delay, and the biggest issue and concern was the sustainability of the cover story. Much like D-Day, waiting 1 more day with Eisenhower, and how long could he hold off on fooling the Germans? Anyway, the Explorer's arrival at Long Beach, and here we are. This is at the pier, Pier E, where it was its home base. When it arrived, it was a huge event, and the media lapped it up. It was not uncommon to see John Wayne chilling in shorts on his boat, and workers aboard the Explorer hollered when Peter Fonda cruised past on a yacht loaded with beautiful women in bikinis. Work immediately got underway converting it into the spy ship. The conversion included a number of labs inside shipping containers that could be slipped into open spaces as a ship without raising any alarms. And some of the things that they had that they loaded on was a dark room, spaces for nuclear materials, decontamination room, drying, preserving documents, waste handling, and catch this, you're going to hear more. A refrigerated room for storing any bodies or human remains that might be found. By the end of March 74, Explorer is ready to roll. And it then met the barge. Here's the barge. This is a real-time picture, folks, back then. And the barge is not submerged yet. It's been floated out, pushed out by sea tugs, as you saw before, and it's sitting there. It's waiting till nighttime. And at that point, it's flooded. The ballast is flooded. It goes underneath, and the Explorer arrives, and the capture vehicle comes up the bottom and is put into the moon pool. So, June 7th, after more debate, Nixon personally approved launching the mission. Now, this is critical and important. Just before Explorer set sail, his Asuma office, and that's one of Hughes's offices in Burbank, was burglarized, and it made front page news in the LA Times and received some national attention. Basically, 4 men had broken into several safes and made off with $68,000 and some valuables and an undetermined number of company files. Remember this event. Okay, June 21st, Explorer departs on its 3,000-mile voyage from Long Beach to the project targeted recovery area. 6 years belatedly from the sinking of K-129. It took 6 years. The crew had been informed of the mission's true story and associated dangers, and they were given life insurance, and while they provided emergency contacts to their local, spouses and everything. Here's some of the engineers. Here's some of that complex machinery that I mentioned too, earlier. The heavy lift system, lifting the pipe string and all that, contained 48 hydraulic pumps that had to work in parallel. And taking the pipe string, the pipe pieces, and putting them together, and then screwing them together so that they would have, in essence, doubles, as I mentioned earlier, took 6 different machines. So as you can see, they did need testing. Okay, as if that wasn't dicey enough, let me go back for just a second to this slide. So July 4th, 1 p.m., Explorer arrives at the recovery site and immediately began setting up their dynamic positioning system. Soon, they had to endure both a typhoon and a tropical storm. After that, every step forward seemed to result in 2 steps backwards as various parts making up the complex systems failed and needed repair. As if that weren't enough, the crew had to cope with near continuous 3 weeks of Russian surveillance. Here's the first ship that arrived. It was hung around for a couple days. And then after that, this SB-10 would arrive. And this is a converted tugboat, sea tugboat. And it would harass Explorer day and night for 2.5 weeks. Now, what's great and incredible is that while all this was going on, and this ship right here, SB-10, was coming within 50 feet of Explorer. While all that was going on, work continued on Explorer. July 21st, the capture vehicle, Clementine, finally begins its descent. 8 days later, late evening on the 29th, the capture vehicle arrived over the target object. Capture vehicle being the Claw, Clementine. This was the 26th day at the recovery site. Here is the mission control room on the left. The engineers used a 12 closed circuit TVs to monitor and position the capture vehicle over the target object. I've got to tell you, this is an amazing little tidbit. The water was crystal clear at 17,000 feet. And incredibly, a large hammer was spotted on the sub's hull. Mystery, everybody was wondering, how could this happen? The mystery was solved when an Explorer pipe handler remembered dropping one overboard while working on a rig floor during the capture vehicle's descent. Incredibly, that hammer had fallen 3 miles through the water and ended up on the deck of K-129. July 31st, the capture vehicle touches down right here. 1/2 hour later, its fingers begin to dig into the soil beneath the target object with 2 million pounds of force. Now, one thing that they never were able to test before this was how hard was this seabed? Well, they found out it was harder than what they expected. And much discussion ensued. And eventually it was decided to add another 1,000,000 pounds of force to the hydraulics. Not everyone agreed, including the onboard capture vehicle or target, Clementine contractor. 7 hours later, the fingers were finally under the target object and the missile containment net was deployed and 4 cylinder breakout legs were then extended. August 1st, 2:48 a.m. Cheers erupt in the mission control room as the target object was freed from the seafloor and its lift upwards began, and the pipe was slowly retracted. Here's a depiction. The water jets shooting down, enabling the target, everything to move up away from the seafloor. And you can see 2 of the breakout legs, as I mentioned, being left behind. Now, because of the weight involved, how many pounds did I say? I'll remind you, 16 million. Everyone on board could hear the ship creak and groan as the sub ascended. The lift speed increased as the doubles, and that's, again, 2 pipes put together, each weighing 40,000 pounds, were retrieved. 3 days later, August 4th, 6:53 a.m., the capture vehicle is only 9,000 feet from the surface. The Explorer shakes slightly, like a small earthquake, and then appears to relax. This fellow right here, Dave Sharp, he was a director of recovery systems and this is him in his office on board Explorer. He was with the program from get to go. And his quotes are as follows. I went up to the control room. Go back. Here's the control. And everything looked normal there. They're all still looking at the submarine and the claws. And I said, you sure you got all the targets there? Yeah, everything's fine, came the response. Sharp continued, oh, wait a minute. We haven't refreshed the closed circuit TV. They were looking at old images. They refreshed the closed circuit images and gone. In an instant, a big chunk of the K-129, 6 years in the taking, had tumbled back to the seafloor. After all that, Sharp said, quote, it just fell away. The capture vehicle had failed, and the only way to determine what was left of the sub was to bring the remains up into the moon pool and examine it. Now, by the way, Dave Sharp is the only CIA employee to have ever written a book about this project, and he went through hell to do it, as you might imagine. It took him 5 years, and he had to go through the CIA's notorious publication review board process. Took him 2 years to do that. As he was doing that, he heard accusations of treason. You can go on and imagine the rest of it. By the way, the entire salvage operation, including the memorial service that you're going to hear about shortly, was recorded by the CIA documentary film crew. The recovery portion has never been declassified. Okay, at Langley, here we go again. There's Duckett. I told you we'd be back to him. He is bouncing off the walls after Mr. P broke the news to him. Duckett, he was stunned at the Explorer's mission control when he sent a cable ordering them to return to the bottom to recover the sub. Then he demanded an open, undeciphered, here we go with the Russians in Daytona 500 looking for their sub. He did the same thing, undeciphered line to personally deliver the command. Duckett was eventually calmed down enough so the situation can be explained. Bottom line, with the claw broken, there's no way to return to the bottom and recover the remainder of the target object. The next message received by Mission Control simply read, proceed with plan to continue the ascent. Duckett hated sending that message. Of course, here's Langley, and here's Duckett, Colby. Now, by now, folks, we're into the Gerald Ford administration. We've crossed into three of them now, three administrations. And here's Schlesinger, who's Secretary of Defense at this point in time. Curtis Crook, who you remember was the engineer, he'd be happy, more than happy, to make the repairs and improvements, and all could be accomplished as long as the cover story held up. August 6th, the remains, and this is basically a great depiction of what was left, goes into the moon pool. And the following day, the divers inspect, and it confirmed their worst fears. This was all that was left, and that 2 fingers had broken away from Clementine, and only a third of the target object was rescued. What the CIA had wanted most was history. It was gone. In the afternoon, they began pumping out water of the moon pool. The following day, August 8th, they wrapped things up and departed for Hawaii, where they would conduct full exploitation of the sub. Ironically, this is the same day that Nixon, who had championed the whole project, resigned because of Watergate. The following day, with the moon pool pumped out, radiation experts conducted a thorough inspection. Interestingly, the radiation levels were lower than expected, with evidence of plutonium being found. Hence, initial exploitation of the sub began with paper jumpsuits. The following day, only took a couple days there, the air becomes filled with a stench of rotting flesh. 6 crew members, 3 with IDs and body parts of others, were discovered in the debris. Unbelievably, they had been preserved for 6 years in a shrunken state as a result of the intense pressure at 17,000 feet and a steady ambient temperature of 32 degrees. Now exposed to warm air and oxygen, they had quickly began to deteriorate. Unbelievably and ironic, guess what else they found when they went in to start looking at, the remains here? They came across submanganese nodules. So their cover story that they laid on everybody, in essence, it was true to some degree. 3 weeks later, September 4th, having been stored in a refrigerated van, the 6 Soviet sailors were finally buried at sea with full military honors. Remember that mid-June burglary at the SUMA office in Burbank? One of the stolen documents had detailed the agreed upon structure of the Hughes CIA cover arrangement for the project. The CIA was forced to work with LAPD to capture the thieves, who were demanding $100,000 because they had found out that one of the documents, as I mentioned, tied everything together. Well, the CIA eventually paid the ransom, and CIA Director Colby personally appealed to this fellow right here, Seymour Hersh. He was a top investigative reporter for the New York Times, to not disclose the project as it would create an international incident. He and the rest of the media cooperated for a while. February 7th, 1975, LA Times published, here we go. This is front page, folks. A story that loosely connected the robbery, Hughes, the CIA, and the recovery operation. As a result, journalists flooded into Long Beach, where Curtis Crook was preparing Explorer and a stronger version of the capture vehicle with enhanced, stronger, more flexible fingers for the second mission to go back and get the rest of it. And it was known as Operation Matador to complete the job. 5 weeks later, syndicated columnist and TV personality, this fellow right here, I'm sure you all recognize him as Jack Anderson. He broke a more detailed version of the story to a national audience by way of his mutual radio network in a special report. The following day, Hirsch releases his report on the front page of the New York Times, and he referred to the operation as a massive CIA $350 million boondoggle. Now, quite frankly, he was only referring to the Glomar, the Explorer, the ship. The White House immediately circled the wagons to come up with a response. Here are all the boys in the room. President Ford decided, after all said and done, not to say anything unless the Soviets responded. This freed Brezhnev to ignore the incident and proceed with Assault 2 negotiations, which we knew he dearly wanted. In addition, disclosure of this project would have proven to be very embarrassing for the Soviets. So, after this, a journalist then filed a Freedom of Information Act seeking info on contracts during the Explorer's construction. The CIA huddled and responded with the now familiar, it could neither confirm nor deny the existence of those materials. And that's where that phrase came from, folks, that you hear all the time anymore. It's known as the Glomar response. And it held up as in court twice. And it thwarted all inquiries for decades. By the way, here's the CIA's first tweet, which you'll get a grin out, 2014. And it says, we can neither confirm nor deny that this is our first tweet. Within a year, Colby, Duckett, and Mr. P were history. They would all resign from the CIA. Fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union is dissolved and the Russian Federation was created with Boris Yeltsin elected as first president. In October of 92, as part of a diplomatic effort, CIA director at that time, Robert Gates, visited Moscow. He informed Yeltsin that the only K-129's forward bow section had been recovered, along with 6 Soviet sailors, and presented them with 2 items as a, quote, gesture of intent and symbol of a new era. The Soviet flag was number 1 that shrouded the coffins just of the Soviet sailors, and a portion of the videotape that showed their dignified military burial at sea, complete with the Soviet national anthem and prayers translated into Russian. I took a screen capture of that video. It's on YouTube, and it's called Burial at Sea, September 4th, 1974, if you're interested. Of course, Gates didn't go over there to just make everybody feel good. He had an ulterior motive, as he wanted to inspire Russia to reciprocate with information about the American pilots that had been lost over the Soviet Union years before. Shortly afterwards, Yeltsin, not believing everything, commissioned a panel of experts to inventory Russian nuclear materials lost or dumped at sea, and the report concluded that at least the CIA had recovered at least 2 of the nuclear-armed torpedoes. In August, another diplomatic gesture was made by Ambassador Malcolm Toon as he presented the K-129's bell to the Russian delegation. Now, this turned out to cause quite the stir, as the bell is located here. So if all of this had fallen away, how did we come up with the bell? Well, after a lot of work, I'll just leave it at that, it is now generally agreed that the bell had been removed from the sail structure and stowed in the bow compartment when it went to sea, the 129. Okay, we're almost done, folks. Fast forward to December 2007. Excuse me. Okay, 2007. The CI receives a Freedom of Information Act request that it couldn't ignore or answer with the GLOMAR response. While scouring some unclassified documents at the National Security Archive, a researcher had come across a reference to an internally generated CIA history of Azorian. Since it was referenced in a publicly available archive, the CIA was now stuck and had to respond. Still, they stiffed everybody for 2 years and did not respond over that period of time. After all said and done, January 2010, that 50-page article that was written in 1985, and it was their in-house journal, and it was called, which is called the Studies in Intelligence, that was released. Now that article was written, 1984 was the edition where that article was housed in the internal studies of intelligence. That article, however, had been written 7 years prior, 1978, by a participant in the operation whose identity remains classified. However, the material at the time was considered so sensitive when it was written that it was deemed unpublishable. Even with the decision to downgrade some of the material to secret in 1985, it was still intended for internal eyes only. The article discussed the conception and planning of the retrieval effort, as well as the creation of a special ship, Hello, Explorer, and that raised portions of K-129 in August 1974. Although the article was informative, it was heavily redacted. Hello, we seen this recently? Well, it continues, doesn't it? Here is page 12 of the 50 pages. Here is a ton of information on page 29. By the way, there were 7 more pages that looked exactly like this. So, frustrating to many, there was no mention of the following: the massive cost overruns that threatened to shut down the program during the early stages, any description of the capture vehicle. Remember, that was the most closely guarded secret of the operation. Most importantly, what the heck did the CIA get out of all this? What was brought to the surface, and what intelligence was derived from its exploitation? Okay, in summary, with no info on what was recovered, and we know that Operation Matador was in process to return, many believe the project failed to accomplish many of its primary goals. The mission ultimately cost a whopping $800 million. Now, this is a few years ago. Currently, that's well over $4 billion. And in addition, 6 years of top secret preparation. This revelation, along with others from additional rumored intel activities, led to the formation of the predecessor of today's Senate Select Committee on Intel. And it was known back then, named for this fellow's namesake, it's the Church Committee. This is Senator Frank Search from Idaho. 1975 is when this photo was taken. As a result of this committee, they would bring the hammer down hard on the CIA. The CIA would never again have day-to-day control over any future spy operation. However, connective tissue with some of our more incredulous black op underwater missions still remains to this very day. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but I could tell you there is connective tissue. While some intel was undoubtedly recovered, perhaps the real success of Project Azorian should be measured by the confusion and resultant financial burden it placed upon the Soviet Union for so many years, when it could least afford it, which had always been one of the primary objectives by the CIA. Uncertainty over the findings forced the Soviet Navy to assume the worst and make substantive and costly changes, particularly to its submarine forces. Route selections, reporting protocols, test schedules had to be altered. New cryptographic hardware had to be developed and code books issued, and construction of their new subs were also materially affected. The mission, more as important as all that, this mission sent a very powerful message to any potential adversary of the United States. No other country had the wherewithal nor the chutzpah to attempt anything like this. Beyond the recovery, Project Azorian still remains legendary within the intel community and inarguably is one of the greatest feats in naval engineering history. As a result, in 2006, because of the significant contribution of the evolution of mechanical engineering, Explorer finally received its due recognition as it was designated, quote, a historic mechanical engineer's landmark. I hope you enjoyed the journey. It's been my privilege. Thank you.
Absolutely amazing, Jim. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We had a couple of questions that I think you answered, but I just want to clarify. With regard to classified and declassified, there are some aspects of this that are still not declassified. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And someone else asked a question about the cost. And I think you said you would estimate the cost at 800 million. That would equate
at that time.
At that time, that would equate
to Explorer was it did cost about 350 million just for Explorer, but you got the target object, you got the barge, and you got all the time that all these fellows put in, the contractors and all of that. So it added up ballpark 800 million, which is more than 4 billion today.
Okay. Whatever happened to the Explorer?
There it is. Only one item component is still in existence today. It's the barge. And let me walk through this real quick. I think people appreciate it. When Operation Matador, remember the second recovery attempt, was canceled, the capture vehicle, Clementine, remember it was the most secret and unexplainable, was immediately disassembled inside the barge. So it was just ripped apart. The Explorer returned to Long Beach in '74, and basically it was rented out for deep sea drilling later on. And eventually in 2015, Transocean, which there are several companies that would take over each other, Global Marine later became Transocean. It was scrapped. So this is history. Now, this barge is still operational today for quite some time. It housed and transported prototype stealth ships, and this is the Sea Shadow. As an example, it no longer does that. It is now a floating dry dock for ship repairs at the Bay Shipyard in California.
And because we're in Women's History Month, Jim, I got to ask, to the best of your knowledge, were there any women involved in this operation or on the ship?
I have not read of any, but that doesn't mean there weren't some. My Dave Sharp, where I got most of my day-to-day information, and his book is incredible. And it is day-to-day as to what happened. And there was a log as to what occurred day-to-day and everything that is accessible. And anyway, I did not come across any women in the log, but who knows? I'm not sure.
Suba, I think I've covered all the questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jim. So anyway, some parting words on behalf of ARP Virginia. Again, I'd like to thank Jim for sharing his valuable time and knowledge with us this afternoon as he brings his passion to all his presentations. Now, I was not surprised in your presentation to see Howard Hughes involved in this, but I never knew that the gray goose was not meant to fly. I always thought that he was trying to fly that sucker all over the place. So that was something very interesting that I learned today. But we'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you will see a link to a survey. Please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us. We'll also send this link in a follow-up email later today. Our Tuesday Explorers programs will continue next week, and we invite you to join us. Now, next week, Blaine Amthor will be back with us as a presenter. It'll be the Atlantic Speed Race of the Great Ocean Liners. So that's next Tuesday at 3 p.m. So please look at www.aarp.org/Tuesday Explorer for information about the following program. And of course, I already told you the title about the presentation next week. In the chat box, you'll see a link to register for upcoming programs, and which is www.aarp.org/virtual VA. So again, folks, we appreciate you joining us today. So until next time, we encourage you to stay curious and keep exploring. Thank you, folks.